The sun had barely risen over the small town of Tyler, Texas. A thin layer of mist clung to the fields, giving the morning a ghostly calm. Inside the hangar, the SkyCare 7 air ambulance was prepped for what was expected to be a routine medical transport. 2 patients lay on stretchers, stabilized but fragile. One was a young girl recovering from a severe car accident. The other, an elderly man suffering from internal bleeding after a fall. Paramedics moved with precision, checking oxygen lines, heart monitors, and IV drips. The pilot, James "Jim" Harwood, was a seasoned air ambulance veteran. With thousands of flight hours logged, he had always prided himself on his ability to make split-second decisions. Today, though, urgency clouded his judgment. "Time is critical," he said to his co-pilot, Mark Reynolds, his voice calm but firm. "We have to get them to Dallas before the hospitals there can't save them." Mark nodded but glanced at the weather report on his tablet. Fog patches were predicted along their flight path, accompanied by gusty crosswinds. "We need to be careful," Mark warned. "Visibility drops sharply around the ridge near Cedar Hill." Jim waved off the concern. "I've flown that route dozens of times. We'll be fine." The rotors of SkyCare 7 whirred to life, vibrating through the hangar as the crew made final checks. The patients were secure, paramedics strapped in, and the equipment confirmed functional. As the helicopter lifted, the small town receded beneath a soft blanket of morning mist. For a moment, everything was peaceful. The paramedics exchanged quiet reassurances, and Jim steered the craft toward the open skies. But clouds had begun forming unexpectedly low along the flight path. The mist thickened into a gray haze, and visibility began to decline faster than forecasted. Mark's unease grew, but Jim continued, trusting his instincts over instruments. "The quicker we go, the better their chances," he said, almost to himself. By mid-flight, the landscape was almost invisible. Rolling hills, power lines, and treetops were obscured by a thick layer of fog. The rotor blades cut through the mist, sending droplets scattering across the windows. Inside, tension mounted. The paramedics monitored the patients, adjusting oxygen and checking vitals, while Jim tried to maintain a steady altitude using visual cues. This was a dangerous mistake. Flying in dense fog without relying on instruments increased the risk of spatial disorientation, a condition that could make even an experienced pilot misjudge altitude and distance. Suddenly, a gust of wind hit the helicopter from the left, tilting it sharply. Jim struggled to counter it, but the rotors struck a tall pine tree near the ridge. The cabin shook violently, alarms blaring as medical equipment toppled. Paramedic Laura Simmons yelled, "Brace! Brace!" The helicopter lurched downward, and oxygen masks swung like pendulums. Monitors beeped frantically as the young girl's heart rate spiked. Jim fought to stabilize the aircraft. He was skilled, confident, but overconfidence can be deadly. Instead of ascending to safer altitude or circling back, he pushed forward, believing he could regain control. Another gust of wind caught the tail rotor, spinning the helicopter sideways. The landscape beneath became a blur of gray and dark green. Jim's heart pounded. Every second mattered, yet every decision carried the weight of life and death. The helicopter clipped another tree. Sparks flew as metal met bark. Paramedics shouted orders, trying to hold the patient steady, but the aircraft began a rapid, uncontrollable descent toward uneven terrain. Time seemed to stretch. Inside, the cabin felt like a rolling cage, twisting and turning with the wind. The helicopter hit the ground hard in a remote wooded area. Rotors splintered, glass shattered, and medical equipment scattered across the snow-dusted ground. The cabin crumpled partially upon impact, trapping the victims and crew in a nightmare scenario. Paramedics and the pilot were bruised and shaken. Jim barely escaped serious injury, but the reality was unbearable. The patients did not survive. Immediate rescue attempts were hampered by the fog and dense forest. The crash site was chaotic. Broken rotors, twisted metal, spilled medical supplies, and the faint sound of alarms still blinking weakly on the monitors. It was a scene that would haunt everyone involved for years. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, arrived to examine the wreckage. Their findings were stark. The pilot ignored critical weather advisories.
Flying below safe altitude in fog was the primary cause. Overconfidence and haste directly contributed to the fatal crash. The news spread quickly. Air ambulance pilot's mistake gets patients killed. Families were devastated. The tragedy sparked national attention, questioning the safety protocols of air ambulances. Hospital administrations and aviation authorities responded with immediate changes: mandatory adherence to weather warnings, no exceptions, minimum safe altitudes strictly enforced, improved communication between pilots and medical teams, enhanced simulator training to prepare pilots for high-stress emergency scenarios. For the survivors, the paramedics and the pilot, the trauma was deep. Laura Simmons, the paramedic who had shouted for everyone to brace, later said in an interview, "I kept thinking, we're going to make it, we have to." But it wasn't enough. 2 lives were gone and I couldn't save them. It stays with you forever. Jim Harwood faced disciplinary action. He underwent extensive retraining and counted.
Selling. The incident became a personal reckoning, a reminder that even experience and confidence cannot override caution when lives are at stake. Families of the victims shared their grief publicly, urging changes to prevent similar tragedies. Their advocacy contributed to stricter safety regulations for air ambulances nationwide. The SkyCare 7 crash was more than a tragic headline. It became a case study in human error, high-pressure decision-making, and aviation safety. Pilots and medical crews across the country learned hard truths. Never compromise safety for speed, even when seconds seem critical. Trust instruments, not instincts, in low-visibility situations. Communication is vital between medical staff and pilots and with air traffic control. Training saves lives. Simulators and drills prepare crews for unexpected events. The story of SkyCare 7 reminded the aviation and medical communities that urgency does not excuse recklessness. Lives depend on discipline, patience, and humility in the cockpit. Years later, Jim Harwood reflected on that morning. The fog, the gusts, the rushing heartbeat of his patients, all of it remained vivid. He spoke often at training seminars, sharing his story with aspiring pilots. Confidence is important, but humility saves lives. Always respect the sky and never take shortcuts, no matter the pressure. The incident became a cautionary tale, taught in aviation schools, air ambulance training, and emergency response seminars. It transformed policies and saved countless lives, though it could never undo the tragedy of that morning. The crash of SkyCare 7 is remembered not only for its tragedy, but for its lessons in responsibility, human fallibility, and courage under pressure. It reminds us that in life or death situations, even the smallest mistake can have irreversible consequences, and that safety must always take precedence over haste. Though 2 lives were lost, their story became